Well, hello and happy Thursday. We are joining you again for Pastor's Podcast. We hope that you guys had a wonderful Thanksgiving. We're able to spend some time with friends and family. And we look forward to sharing with you again this ministry here at Maranatha Bible Church. We are located in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And we are going to be continuing our series, but we're going to pivot a little bit. So last week we ended talking with your in-laws, or 2 weeks ago we ended talking with your in-laws, which was a wonderful discussion.
Heard some things you probably didn't want to hear, right?
Yeah, well, it was great just to be a fly on the wall and hear their high thoughts of marriage. So,
Yes.
But we're going to pivot, and so we're done talking kind of about marriage, husband and wife. Want to cover some other topics. Want to cover families. We want to cover children. We want to cover parenting. But for the next few weeks, we want to cover singles, because singles are part of the family. Broadly speaking, part of the family of God, part of the church, but they also have families themselves, right? And so we want to make sure we spend some time talking about singles as they're part of the body here.
Yeah, so we don't want to in any way communicate that we're wanting to gloss over those in that category. We've had a few questions throughout this marriage series, and it's been quite a few weeks, I think, on marriage, 10, 12 weeks or something like that. We've been dealing with marriage issues, and it's all been good. We've had a few questions just from some of the singles in our church about how do we think about our state and our status, and so we should probably just begin by saying we are so thankful for the singles in our church.
Right.
We don't ever want to exclude them in any fashion, and we want to make sure that they know that they're a part of our body, an integral part of our body, and all of us were single at one point. And,
That's right.
And so those of us that are married and with families, we want to express our gratitude and appreciation for the singles that we do have. They're a vital part of our church. In fact, in many ways, our church wouldn't or couldn't function the way that it does were it not for the singles and the way they serve our body and care for us. So,
Because it's not just singles pre-married, but it's also those who are widowed, who also are serving the church and or divorced for reasons. But those people who don't have, so when we say single, just to make sure we're not talking about a 28-year-old woman or man, right? We're also talking about the older men and women who maybe were married at one time and for whatever reason they're not anymore.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's easy just to categorize singles as 18 to 24 and we lock into that, but there are other people in other stages of life that are single, and so all of that together is encompassed in this series over the next couple of weeks.
That's good. So what we first want to do is build the theological significance of singleness, right? So before we get into, here's what you can be doing, here's what you should be thinking, here's how you're preparing, here's how you're serving, all of those kind of things. We want to build the foundation because the Bible speaks specifically about singles, not all over the place for sure. Generally speaking, it's kind of confined to 1 Corinthians 7. So we're going to dive into that, but we want to make sure that we're building our base and our foundation, and then from there we're going to launch off into the practical applications of that,
good.
right? So kind of the first thing we want to do is just look at these three verses, 1 Corinthians 7, and then verses 7 through 9. I'm just going to read them just in case people don't have their Bible with them. But Paul's writing here to the Corinthian church, and he says, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one this way and another that, and another that. But I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." Right? So he does speak on singles throughout chapter 7, but we're just going to kind of hone in on these three verses here. And so the first thing we want to do is look at some responses that the church has had. Statistically speaking, singles now, it's like 300% more singles in the normal or mainstream evangelical church than what there has been over the course of the last 50 years, right? So we are seeing a lot more singles. And the reason for that is people are getting married at a later age. Look at 27 for females and 29 for males, I think is what I read, where before that was in the teens, right? So you're looking at, almost 10 to 12 years later, you're already getting into, college or your trade and your career, if you will. And so that's why churches have actually expanded their groups from college groups to college and career to college career single. And so you're kind of seeing the church kind of give this flow. So there's three main kind of responses given from churches or even from singles back to churches that we want to address before we get rolling.
So these might be some of the misconceptions.
Yeah, we would say these are misconceptions, either from the church to the singles or from the singles to the church.
Sure.
Because both have happened, right? So we want to make sure we're tackling this right from the beginning. So first of all, singleness is really a curse from God. So you're single, it's a curse. What do? I feel like I've been cursed. I'm a single guy. I desperately want to get married. But there's just no hope. I've obviously been cursed. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is, for someone who longs to be married, I can see how they might feel that way. You might think, well, you've done something that God is punishing you for,
Right.
or maybe there's something in your past where you just feel like God's kind of holding that over your head, and if that hadn't happened, then you'd maybe be married by now. And so you almost feel like you are under this curse.
So that's common, right? Because you have sexual sin, like even before you're saved, or even as you were saved, maybe as a teenager or whatever, but you've had some sort of sexual sin. So your mind automatically goes to that tit for tat.
Yeah.
Like, I did this, so now God's punishing me in this way.
Yeah, and I think we have to really reject that kind of thinking, because God doesn't operate that way.
Right.
He's not a God who says, okay, you did that, well, all right, I'm going to hold this against you.
Your whole life.
And if you fix it, then I'll bless you. That's not how God is. He's not that kind of God. He's a kind God. He's a gracious God. In fact, I was just thinking, Psalm 84:11, the Lord is a sun and a shield. The Lord gives grace and glory. No good thing does he withhold from those who walk uprightly. I think that's a good reminder that that's the character of God. He doesn't withhold anything from those who are his children. And so this whole idea that singleness is a curse, if you're listening to this, you really need to remove that thinking from the way you think, because that's not God's MO. That's not how he operates. So God, we're going to get into this, has you at this point in your life for a reason.
Right.
And so you're not a second-class Christian. You're not a second-class church member. You're not looked at in a certain way as if you're walking around here and all of us think you're cursed and, oh, I wonder what they did in their past to deserve this.
Right.
That is not pleasing thinking to the Lord. So we don't think that way.
Right.
And we have to remember every single one of us at one point was single.
That's right.
So
And we sinned while we were single.
Exactly. And so that's not how God works.
That's good. So that's a good exhortation to the singles not to have that mindset, but it's also a good exhortation to the church not to look at them and think, ooh, I wonder what they did to cause them to be this way.
That's right.
Right. That's good. The second thing that's oftentimes expressed, especially from those who are married to those who are single, is singleness is just another excuse to be selfish, right? And so how would you say, hey, how would you exhort somebody? I come to you and I say, hey, I'm trying to get married, and my friends who are married, they're telling me you're just being selfish. You just like living life for yourself. You just like having all the money. You don't want to have any bills. You don't have any responsibility. That's why you're not getting married.
Well, I think you may have some situations like that. I'm not ruling that out. There could be some people who have that thought process. They might just think, well, I'm going to maximize my singleness for myself, and I'm going to make as much money as I can, and I'm going to live for my own glory. And I'm not saying that's not a possibility, but I think you and I would probably agree that most people in our church who are single are not thinking that way.
Right.
They're not in any way living a selfish life. They're not trying to suck all of life out that they can and pad their bank account and live their glory years, in these younger stages. I just don't see that in the heart of most believers that are single. That might be true outside the church.
Sure, absolutely.
Very true of unbelievers. But
Right.
I don't know, what's your experience with people that you've interacted with that way?
Yeah, I would say by and large, the vast majority of single people would not be living that way. In fact, as you said, and I think that's a good distinction, believers generally are looking for some sort of marriage relationship, especially as they're, get older into their later 20s and early 30s. I don't know if I could honestly say I've met someone who is single who is saying, hey, I am just here to live the lifestyle. You know, like you see the stickers on the back of people's cars. I was thinking of this. You got husband, wife, and the 3 kids. And sometimes it's like husband, wife, and a stack of money because they don't have any kids. You know, you don't see that one person with a stack of money, right?
Right.
And so I don't believe that to be true. Once again, though, I mean, this is where each individual person has to check their own heart. Because even though someone might say, no, that's not my motive, perhaps in the back of their mind, it may not be their motive, but it may be a fear that they have. Like as a man, he may be fearing like, man, there's no way I'd be able to lead a wife. And so instead of looking for that wife, they're not motivated by fear. So maybe it's not greed necessarily, but there's still a fear there that's keeping him. And we know that any decision we make from fear is not a decision from the Lord. Like you're not walking in the Spirit if you're being led by fear. And so it's just searching your heart in that matter.
Yeah, I remember at one part of my ministry a number of years ago, there were a number of guys that were just diehard bachelors to the rapture.
Bachelors to the rapture.
You know, just I'm never getting married. I'm going to live the single life. And their persuasion, their thought was more, I want to be the martyr on the mission field. You know, so that was the mentality. And I don't think it was necessarily, I want to go and live to my own glory, but I think there was an element of pride in that. You know, I want to just I'm gonna live my life as a bachelor and not do the hard thing of marriage and family, and so I think there is an element sometimes, and I've seen it more in men than women in the church, that there is sometimes this martyr complex that, you know, I don't want to just get married and have kids.
Right.
I want
to
settle down. I want to go out in a blaze of glory on the mission field, and I think that's just that is a form of selfishness.
Yeah.
And not to say that God doesn't use single people in missions, and obviously there's all kinds of examples of that throughout church history. But the flip side of that is we have to be careful that we just don't read that selfishness in to every single person that we meet. By and large, that's not the case.
I would agree, yeah. And that actually leads well into the next category. In the next category, I would say I have heard probably the most out of meeting with and discussing marriage with single people, regardless of the age. And that would be that I'm inevitably single because I can't find a godly spouse. Whether it be a man who is looking for the right woman, or whether it be a woman who is looking for a godly man. I personally would say, and I think you'd agree, it's harder for a woman to find a godly man, right? Just within the kind of ethos of the culture that we live in. But how do you counsel that single individual that says, look, I'm trying, but you know, there's not a whole lot of godly fish out there in the big sea?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think first and foremost, if you want to find the right person, you've got to be the right person. So it's easy to get so focused on finding Mr. or Miss Right and, you know, getting married to them, and that's the object, the goal, kind of the objective. And yet, at the same time, we have to remember that God is working in your heart. God is growing you, sanctifying you, maturing you. So as much as He is maybe preparing that other person for marriage to you, He's also preparing you for marriage to that person.
That's right.
And so even before you get to have I found the right person, is you got to be the right person. So you may have to just, you know, say, okay, Lord, grow me, stretch me. There's probably some areas I need to grow in. And so that's one area. I think another area is, I want to be careful how I say this, but there are in some cases on the part of men, single men, a desire to delay marriage. And so there might be some legitimacy to this concern. It's not that there aren't potential godly men, but I would say to the single young men, maybe you need to think more seriously about, are you pursuing a godly woman? Do you have in mind marriage? Is that something you're looking forward to? Are you striving for that, or are you delaying that? That seems to be the culture's tendency in the last couple decades, is
Absolutely.
To delay marriage.
But you see that in the age of men getting married at 29, as opposed to being almost a decade earlier, just 50 years ago.
Right.
You know, not in my lifetime of 50 years, but you know,
Hey, you're 41.
yeah, too. Yeah, but
42.
yeah. So I think that's really important, is that you also have the career narrative being pushed, right? And so with the feminism coming in and the women saying, hey, I can do it on my own, that idea actually lends itself to a man saying, well, if she wants to do it on her own, let her do it on her own.
True.
And so maybe he goes and takes care of himself, and he gets an education, he gets a job, whatever it is that he does, without ever thinking of a woman, because our culture is saying women are taking care of themselves. And so in his mind, he's saying, okay, well, if women are taking care of themselves, how can I actually fit into that? Not an excuse by any means, because we shouldn't be thinking the way the culture does. And so, yeah, we need to encourage our singles to, are you thinking through marriage? And if you are, it's a good thing. Because as you said, are you being prepared as God is preparing somebody else for you? I think that's really helpful advice.
Yeah, that's good.
So those are just three of the common objections or common kind of things you hear throughout the church. So we want to biblically think through singleness. And so we're going to look at those three verses again, 1 Corinthians 7 through 9. And we're going to talk about the difference, singleness and married, as Paul compares and contrasts them here in 7 through 9. And so first of all, Paul talks to each person, right? Both the married and the single. And Paul actually says, yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am, which Paul was single at this time. However, each man has his own gift from God, one this way and the other one that. So the first thing I want to do is define this word gift. You and I talked about this, and which we absolutely agree on, but I think this, when we see or hear or read gift in Scripture, our mind automatically goes to the list of gifts, 1 Corinthians, Romans, right? And so, but that's not what Paul's talking about here. So you want to just kind of briefly define this gift versus what a spiritual gift would be?
Well, yeah, it's the same word, actually. It's charisma. So the same word for spiritual gift in Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, and the word for gift here in 1 Corinthians 7 is the same word as charisma. So, but the context is different. And I think that's what we're talking about here. So we don't see singleness in a list of spiritual gifts. Right. You don't see it in 1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12, Ephesians 4, 1 Peter 4. None of those places is singleness listed as a spiritual gift. So when we talk about gift, we have to distinguish between those spiritual gifts that God has given to every believer for the edification of the body, and this marital status, single, married, divorced, whatever, that God has also given to us. And so there's a crossover here. There's some similarities here in that they can both be used as a means to edify others. But I wouldn't say that singleness is a gift on the same plane as spiritual gifts that you see in other categories.
No, it's good. Yeah. And so, first of all, we can't look at this as being bad. So it is a gift from God. And if God, as you just read in Psalm 84, if God withholds nothing good, and he has given you the gift of singleness and or the gift of marriage, then neither one of those can be looked at as bad, because they're coming
Gifts
from a
are
good
good.
God. Gifts are good, absolutely.
I mean, not too many people give bad gifts,
Right.
unless it's some joke or something. But
Right.
God gives, when he gives gifts, he gives good things.
He gives good things, absolutely. So we can't look at, if you're single and you're saying, man, I got stuck with the gift of singleness. Well, first of all, it's just the wrong attitude to have, because you're not being stuck with anything. And the same thing with marriage. You can't say, oh, I got stuck with my spouse. Well, no, God has given you a gift in that. And so the question then is, how do you know if you've been gifted with singleness, right? And so there's a great article by Tim Challies for those of you guys who read his stuff, and I'm semi-quoting what he said there, but basically it was, look at your left hand. If there's a ring, you have the gift of marriage. If there's not a ring, you have the gift of singleness.
Right.
And built into what he said, though, is everyone at some time had the gift of singleness. Because I think, to quote you, no one came out of the womb married.
This is true.
And so we have to remember that we were all in that stage at some time of being gifted to be single. And so everyone has had that. And then some then have the gift of marriage now. And that's not to say that down the road you're not going to be gifted with singleness again as life circumstances happen through death or whatever else means comes.
Yeah, so there are all kinds of gifts. There's a gift of permanent singleness.
Right.
There's the gift of long seasons of singleness and short marriage.
Yeah.
There's the gift of very short seasons of initial singleness, then a very long season of marriage. Then there's the gift of very short singleness, very short marriage, and then a long season of singleness. I think of Anna. Remember Anna?
Yeah, absolutely.
She was married for probably just a very short time and then was a widow till 84 or whatever the age was. She was a widow for a long time. So the issue here is that God sovereignly ordains those circumstances.
Absolutely.
And as you said, each one of those is a gift. Each stage, each status is a gift, and God gives good gifts.
That's right.
So just a couple verses that I was thinking of kind of along the lines of God giving good gifts. One of them is Luke chapter 11, and it's in the context of prayer, and it's not necessarily in the context of singleness, but Luke chapter 11 says that, I say to you, ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it shall be opened. Now suppose one of your fathers is asked by his son for a fish. He will not give him a snake instead of a fish, will he? Or if he's asked for an egg, he will not give him a scorpion, will he? So here's the analogy. Dads don't give bad gifts to their kids. They love their kids. And then Jesus says, if you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him? So obviously it's in the context of prayer and the giving of the Holy Spirit, but the lesson is essentially the same. God gives good gifts.
That's right.
And then I was thinking also of James chapter 1, verse 17, where we see James saying, every good thing bestowed and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there's no variation or shifting shadows. Every good thing and every perfect gift is from above. So God is the giver of all of those things.
That's right.
So we really have to truly trust the Lord in his sovereignty and how he wants to dispense those gifts. That article you referenced by Tim Challies, that says, my circumstances are God's gracious gift to me, and I'm to learn to accept them from his hand as such.
That's good.
So
that's really good. Yeah, I think also when you say, okay, well, how do I know if I'm going from singleness to marriage, right? Because that's the question. And they say, well, how do I know if I have the gift of singleness? Well, if you're single, then right now you have that gift, right? But Paul does add on here in these verses, I think it's very important that he says, but to the unmarried I give but if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion.
Yeah.
And so there is this idea that an unmarried person having a desire to be married, that they are burning with passion, and that's speaking sexually, lustful, right? That instead of, Paul could have said there, hey, suck it up, right? Or he could have said a plethora of things. What did he say? Get married.
Yeah.
Like that's the I don't want to say antidote, you know,
Yeah.
but really it's the thing that solves that issue is
Yeah.
that you are maybe done being single for that time, and now it's time to start praying for a spouse or something like that.
Yeah, in other words, what you're saying is everyone has the temporary gift of singleness.
Right.
Every single one of us. And then God gives the gift of marriage to some people. So how practically do you distinguish whether you have the gift of permanent singleness or temporary singleness? Well, we all have it temporarily. The question is, I think most singles want to know, do they have the permanent gift of singleness?
Right.
And as you just stated very well, I'm not sure I can tie this to book, chapter, and verse, but it seems like to me, if a single person has a longing for marriage, and Psalm 37:4 is right, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. That doesn't mean if I want a red Corvette, he's going to give it to me. It means if I'm walking with the Lord, my desires are going to be consistent with his will for my life. So if that's the case, then it seems to me in most cases, there might be some exceptions to this, but in most cases, I think God will eventually grant that person's desires.
Yeah.
But again, there might be some exceptions and it might not be the case. There might be someone who desperately wants to be married and just the Lord doesn't have that for them. But maybe this is anecdotally, but every person I've met who's wanted to be married has gotten married.
Yeah.
And to draw another analogy, every person who's been married and have wanted children, somehow God has granted to them children.
Right.
the desire was still there. God blessed that desire, whether through biological children or foster care or adoption or whatever. So again, I'm not sure I would absolutely die 100% on that hill, but it seems like that's a good yardstick.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's what I was trying in Psalm 37. And I think, verse 4 that you quoted is exactly correct. And I think what we'll talk about over the next couple weeks is the verses kind of surrounding verse 4, because what it says in there is trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land, cultivate. And then it says delight yourself, and then commit your way to him, trust in him, and he will do it.
Yeah.
So, you might be saying, hey, I have these desires, but then you're not cultivating it. You're not living in such a way that's saying, I really do have those desires, because the desires of your heart are going to come out in the actions of your hands, right? And that's kind of what the psalmist is saying there. If we are going to desire him, then we have to trust, we have to do good, we have to dwell, meaning, you have to dig into where you are, you have to cultivate and all of that. And I think that's important that people understand. If you have that desire, and it's a true desire, aside from the Corvette, of course, but that God's faithful, and God's going to honor that. But then that leads into the next one, which I think is of the utmost importance, and that is no matter what the gift, and even no matter what the desire, the ultimate goal is to find contentment in the season of life that you're in. I'm a firm believer that God gives us the grace to live in the season we're in, not in the season we want to be in, not in the season we're going into, but exactly where we are. So if we're single, longing to be married, and our mind is always thinking about marriage, and our mind is planning it, we're not actually living today. We're living in a narrative that we're making up. Even if it's true and it comes true, we're still living in a make-believe world instead of like, hey, am I taking care of the things I have here now? So how can singles go about cultivating that contentment in the season of life they're in, even as they have desires and they're looking forward to the next?
Yeah, I would just go to Philippians chapter 4, and I know you'll reference 1 Timothy 6 here in just a moment, but I think of Paul and his circumstances, Philippians chapter 4, he's speaking about this very issue of contentment, where he says, not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. So number one, it's a learned thing. Contentment is not automatic.
That's right.
Contentment is learned. So there's a part of all the circumstances that God has us in, whether single or married, whatever those are, the Lord is using those things to teach us. Learning implies teaching. So there's this element of having to learn contentment. And then verse 12, he says, I know how to get along with humble means, how to live in prosperity in any and every circumstance. I've learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. So here he's learned that regardless of his circumstances, he can trust the Lord.
That's right.
And then that famous verse 13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me, which is what you see at football games,
gyms
and plastered on a billboard, or it has nothing to do with you finding contentment and or succeeding in whatever you want. It's about contentment.
That's right.
So there's an element of having to learn that.
And I would argue that the element of learning is exactly correct. And I would argue that Paul is not speaking of a classroom. Paul is speaking of experientially in life. And so once Philippians was written, you're looking at anywhere from 15 to 20 years he's already been walking with the Lord. And he's saying, I have learned these things. Well, how did he learn these things? There wasn't a seminary that he went to sit down with his favorite professor. When you read through, 2 Corinthians and the list of everything that he went through, all of a sudden you realized how Paul learned contentment. It was through trials, tribulations. It was through knowing that God was always going to come through regardless of the circumstances or situations, and that God was going to give him the strength to get through whatever it is God sent his way, so to speak.
Yeah, I think I've maybe mentioned this here before, or maybe some other class, where I often get asked the question, by singles, what's God's will for my life? How do I make decisions? And oftentimes I'll tell them, listen, you need to understand that God is as concerned about the process as he is the product. So in this discussion, your product, the end goal, is marriage. And that's a good thing, as we've just talked about, it's a gift, but God's as concerned, and maybe more concerned, about the process he takes you through to get you to that point than he is whether you're actually married or not. So there's character growth, there's contentment, there's learning, there's trusting. I just said this to one of my kids recently. You say you trust the Lord, right? but now you're in a situation where you have to trust the Lord.
Mm.
So now you have to practice what you preach.
Right.
And it's really easy to say, I'm content,
Right.
until it becomes hard to not be content.
Right.
And then you have to ask the question, well, maybe the Lord is using this to really cause me to trust him.
That's good. And I like the fact that you can take a verse, Paul's in prison, he's writing this epistle, hard times are coming upon him, and you can take that, and that same application is for the single, because generally speaking, we need to grow in contentment. So I would encourage the singles not to just narrowly look at the 30 verses that apply to them in 1 Corinthians 7, but to look at the entirety of Scripture. If you're a man, these are the things for the men. If you're a woman, here's the things for a woman. And if you're a believer, then everything then is for you, even outside, once you're done with the men and women specific stuff. So as going back to what you said at the beginning, are you preparing yourself in these areas? And I do believe God is more concerned about the preparation. And the reason being is our final marital status here on earth is not our final destination in heaven.
Yeah, that's great. Did you say it earlier when we were talking about it? There is a marriage supper of the Lamb coming?
There's a marriage supper of the Lamb coming where we're going to celebrate that.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think that there's, levels in heaven for married and unmarried. Like the unmarried over here, married over here. Like that's not.
It's faithfulness.
It is faithfulness in what you've been called.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, I hope that this was encouraging to you guys. We will continue talking about singleness in the church, looking at some practical ways that singles can serve. You'll be surprised that there's a lot of the same ways that even the marrieds can serve. But there is a very special promise and a very special responsibility given to singles in the church that Paul talks about here. And we want to hash that out and kind of put some meat on those bones as well for you over the next couple of weeks. So I hope you guys did have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Look forward to worshiping with you on Sunday, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.